In her book, Mirrors and Screams, The Life and Afterlife of Ballet, Marcia B. Siegel writes, "The ballet world has a curious custom of remaking its oldest, best preserved, and most cherished icons. Reasons for this ritual of inverse homage could be anything from the practical to the creative. Still, the idea of updating a monument seems paradoxical. The key question is always, is it still Swan Lake?"
Think about that for a second. We have been berating Disney for the past decade for remaking their old classics, while we in ballet have been doing the exact same thing for over a century. What's really strange to me is that while completely valid reasons exist for you to make your own production of Swan Lake, in an art form as traditionalist as ballet, how is it that Swan Lake keeps getting made with so little regard to this background?
Swan Lake is an 1877 ballet composed by Peter Tchaikovsky and originally choreographed by Julius Reisinger. By 1877, ballet's popularity and respect came about as a result of what happened on stage, not at all because of the music. Music was expected to be at the service of the dance. It ought to not distract from the action on stage, and it was hands, with some notable exceptions like Giselle or Coppelia, composed by local and house composers who would be easily agreeable to the demands of dancers or choreographers.
The ballet master, the choreographer, had complete authority. His word was law, and ballet composers were like musical servants.
In his late 30s, and having started to compose professionally relatively late in his life, Tchaikovsky had none of these preconceived notions about composing for the ballet. It could be argued that he had no preconceived notions about composing for anything. His biographer David Brown writes, "He had no contempt for what might be the functional rather than the inspirational, and though he would take on certain commissions simply because he was short of funds, that did not mean that he was any less diligent in offering the best that was in him."
Back in 1877, Peter Tchaikovsky was a young, relatively closeted gay man. I say relatively because although he was fairly open in his correspondence, especially to his brother Modesto, who was also gay, well, he also feared what the exposition of his private life could do to his professional life and to his family. He even cited his brother and sister as one of the main reasons why he ultimately chose to marry a woman. And it was the 1870s, so unfortunately this was not an unfounded fear.
Although Tchaikovsky had an affinity to music from an early age, composition wasn't an acceptable career choice in a military family like his. So, he studied to become a civil servant and had a non-complicated career as a civil counselor for several years. His passion was always in music though, and in 1862 he enrolled in the New St. Petersburg Conservatory, finally unleashing his musical talents.
When a thing gets around you, you lose every chance you ever had. You'd be forced to leave the conservatoire. Your music would never be played.
In his letters, Tchaikovsky fears that no one will want to listen to his music or learn from his brother Modest if they learn about their homosexuality, also lamenting that both of them will live a whole lifetime without experiencing for a second the fullness of happiness and love. In contrast, when recollecting about the men he loved or in writing to them directly, Tchaikovsky was incredibly passionate. He was explicit about his feelings both romantically and sexually, to a degree that led the Soviet Union to hide many of these letters from the public for years in an effort to sanitize the image of their most famous composer.
Sadly, it actually worked. Perhaps the best example of this is the 1959 short film The Life of Peter Tchaikovsky, produced by the Walt Disney Company to illustrate the release of Sleeping Beauty.
The short grossly overstates Tchaikovsky's brief affair with the only woman he was ever remotely interested in, making it seem like she broke him and that the heartbreak prompted the composition for Swan Lake. However, it's no coincidence that Tchaikovsky would go on to compose multiple pieces with themes like longing, betrayal, fate, conflict, and the burden of responsibility.
Usually I'm remiss to bring any aspect of personal autobiography in a kind of fully musical program. But with Tchaikovsky, we read it a bit differently because he worked with opera and text, and he very magnificently actually coded various elements, we feel, in his life that directly respond to certain words such as fate, death, as passion, etc. And we can actually trace those through a lot of his work, starting with the Fourth Symphony and through the Fifth. It's very interesting to go and just tease out some finer details that actually reveal quite a compelling case that Tchaikovsky is giving us some autobiographical depth, not just in little musical fragments, but actually in how he put the whole thing together.
Swan Lake opens on your average Western European castle, where Prince Siegfried is having a great time with his many friends and peasants until his mother comes over to remind him that he has to get married. This is terrible news for Siegfried, who is absolutely distraught at the concept. So his friend Benno tries to cheer him up with some drinks and some dancing, but none of that works out. Eventually, the boys decide to go outside into the forest for a little hunting.
I can only assume that's the way that 1870s men usually dealt with their problems.
So Siegfried is outside hunting for some swans, and one of them suddenly turns into this beautiful queen. And she's like, please don't shoot me, and he's like, okay, I won't. So she tells him the story about how this lake was made of her mother's tears, and an evil wizard actually bewitched her so she would be a swan, and they never really say his name, but his name is from Rothbard. And she says that she can only be a girl again if somebody ever swears true love to her. So Siegfried is like, oh my god, I could do that, I could be that guy. And she's like, okay, but please don't shoot my friends. And then they dance and they fall in love. The end.
I'm just kidding, we can't have nice things. No.
Back at the castle, the queen has hosted a party so that many beautiful princesses from all over Europe come over to see if one of them will marry her son. But he's like, Mom, I don't actually need you to find me a bride because I met a girl in the forest. And the mom is like, did you though? And she shows up. Except it's actually not a dad. This is Odile. And she shows up with the evil one Rothbard. Siegfried obviously falls for it, and he dances with Odile, and she completely bewitches him, and he is like, Mother, I want to marry this girl. Bam, 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 swears true love to her. By the time he realizes that's not a dad, it's too late. He's already done it, it's done. There's no way to fix it. So Odette goes back to her friends and she's like, oh my god, you guys, he cheated on me. And they're like, oh my god, he's trash. But you know, she probably didn't listen to her friends, because when he comes back and he begs for forgiveness, she's like, okay, I will forgive you. But the underlying lesson is that, you know, some things cannot be undone. So even though she forgives him, she's like, I'm actually going to go and die because I would rather die than be a swan forever, so goodbye. And he cannot live with the horror of what he's done, so Siegfried also jumps into the lake after her.
This isn't to say that there aren't other versions of Swan Lake, but we'll get to that in a minute. Swan Lake premiered at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow, and it flopped. The thing is that the music upset people at the time. They felt it was too distracting and complicated for ballet. Tchaikovsky's intent to tell story through the music wasn't particularly welcome. And this was already a convoluted year for the composer, so he walked away from ballet quite disappointed.
This is actually the only bit that the Disney short portrays somewhat accurately.
Swan Lake was a dismal failure.
Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake repels public at premiere. We predict this was its first and last performance anywhere.
Swan Lake, however, remained in the Bolshoi repertoire until 1893, with some memorable performances, including the one in 1890 that originated the music that we now know as Tchaikovsky Paradelle. But that's a story for another day. Swan Lake wouldn't be a success until 1895, 2 years after the death of Tchaikovsky, who, despite enjoying other successes in music and a famous collaborative relationship with Marius Petipa, would never know the true impact of Swan Lake. In his memoirs, Marius Petipa says he felt the music wasn't to blame for the Moscow flop of Swan Lake. But when Tchaikovsky died in 1893, Petipa had been ill for quite some time. Lev Ivanov was the second ballet master at the Imperial Ballet. Ivanov was a quiet, modest man who danced for Marius Petipa and Jules Perrault, and by his own admission was appointed second ballet master by accident. He learned a great deal about ballet and choreography through his experiences with Petipa, who he described as greatly talented. In 1893, Ivanov was tasked with choreographing Act 2 of Swan Lake for a single performance in Tchaikovsky's memory. It was presented without the context of the story and during an expensive performance with a small audience, but it made an impact. Critics and audiences loved what they saw, mentioning not just Ivanov's choreography, but Perrine and Lignani's extraordinary performance as the Swan Queen. This reception was the catalyst for the Imperial Ballet to begin a new production of Swan Lake. Tchaikovsky's brother Modeste reworked the libretto. Choreography was divided between Ivanov and Marius Petipa. Petipa would choreograph the peasant and royal dances of Acts 1 and 3, and Ivanov would maintain the choreography for Act 2, while additionally choreographing Act 4. Composer Ricardo Drigo was brought on to arrange and adapt Tchaikovsky's score to fit the new production. Multiple things were changed, including the score that now saw about a quarter of Tchaikovsky's original music cut, while different music was added particularly to Acts 3 and 4 from various other Tchaikovsky works. The third act saw massive changes to the now famous Black Swan pas de deux that was taken from a discarded pas de six in Act 1.
None of which actually had a black swan. But the story of the Act 3 pas de deux is so complicated that it could have its own video altogether. Perhaps most notable was the final passage of the ballet.
The new production maintained Tchaikovsky's original ending, but arguably improving it by featuring an apotheosis scene where Odette and Siegfried are glimpsed at in the afterlife, the only place where they can be together at last. This production was a massive success, with critics remarking that both the music and the ballet work in sync to tell the story, and that Swan Lake is a pleasure not only for the eye, but also for the ear. This is also the production after which most Swan Lakes have been created for over a century.
But why is it that Swan Lake is still such a staple? Is it really, as Ivanov's biographer Roland Wiley said, the balletic counterpart of Hamlet or Macbeth? And if there is something that makes Swan Lake special, is that what binds all productions together?
It could be argued that it's the duality of Swan Lake that makes it great. This can be seen explicitly in the choreography, the mystical style of Ivanov with the classical formality of Petipa. It serves to contrast love and betrayal, the dark and the light, the real and the dreamlike. It could also be argued that solely because of Tchaikovsky's score and how it tells stories so powerfully, even independently from the choreography. Swan Lake broke new ground in the complexity of music for ballet, and this also could be the reason why it's still such a staple.
I would argue that it's not the unique genius of any of these factors, but the way they all work together. Art in general, and ballet in particular, is a catalyst for collaboration. So yes, this score is extraordinary, and it does have themes of love and betrayal that resonate with audiences and artists to this day. But I think Petipa and Ivanov saw through the failed 1877 production and choreographed very specifically to its core themes. The Petipa choreography reflects the stiffness of Siegfried's real life, while Ivanov's choreography is meant to evoke the magic softness of that moment where he meets Odette. In Apollo's Angels, Jennifer Homans writes,
Ivanov's lakeside dances in Swan Lake conjure the possibility of a perfect future in which love exists out of time and dancers are joined in a pure plastic and musical art. I think this is what makes a Swan Lake. The underlying story of love that is magical and perfect but can only exist out of time because obligation and responsibilities are what exist in our reality. All of the elements in the ballet coexist for this particular story, for these themes and lessons. It all works because all of them complement each other, and that ought to prevail. There's an inherent dissonance in producing Swan Lake as anything other than a tragedy. It strips away the intent from the score and the structure of the ballet. Some productions are more guilty of this than others because it's one thing to completely redo the ballet, like Graham Murphy or most famously Matthew Bourne's Swan Lake. These are often refreshing takes on the ballet because they're completely new and are never pretending to follow the 1895 production of the classical repertoire. However, most productions actually do. They aim to be classic Swan Lakes while trivializing the score and the story, adding elements that arguably devalue the story and distract from the events and the choreography.
I'm talking, of course, about that wretched jester. If I go see a Swan Lake production and it opens with that awful jester in Act 1, then I already know the rest of my evening is not going to go how I want it to.
This is not a controlled study, and I've never done the numbers, but my educated guess is that 100% of the Swan Lakes that actually feature that unbearable jester also have a happy ending. And a happy ending Swan Lake is an incorrect Swan Lake. I'm not the one making the rules, Tchaikovsky was. He didn't have to write it in notes around his score. The music itself dictates a tragic ending.
It is Odette's music we're hearing, and you hear that real struggle, and slowly but surely, Odette and Siegfried state their love. Odette decides that she's going to go and throw herself in the lake, and Siegfried follows her where they will break the spell. And this is how Tchaikovsky breaks the musical spell. Tchaikovsky turns B minor, that music which is rather sad, indicative of Odette and Siegfried's longing, he turns it to B major. Tchaikovsky's also telling you the story, and if you listen really hard, you'll hear that journey from Siegfried's longing to his happiness in the ever after with Odette at the end.
It's a disservice to the music and to the composer to use the score for Swan Lake as just decoration. Swan Lake always aimed to be a lot more than that. And there's a wealth of classical ballets that have happy endings, so the need to sanitize Swan Lake has always been very strange to me. It's a perfect example of you can't have your cake and eat it too, because once you have Swan Lake, you can't have a happy ending. It really is one or the other.
You have your Don Q's, your Coppelia, your Sleeping Beauty if your heart is really set on Tchaikovsky, but there is no shortage of material if you're looking for a happy ending ballet in the classical repertoire. Coincidentally, these are stories that have been changed way less over the years. Most of these productions still hold a great semblance to their original librettos, but Swan Lake seems to invite an unusual approach that too often ends up erasing all its intent. It's as if Disney's Beauty and the Beast remake had the prince be actually good looking instead of a beast. That's how fundamental the tragic ending is to Swan Lake.
Although, some productions do beg the question, how do people know what's happening on Swan Lake when they not only introduce the awful jester, but they also remove a lot of the mime from the ballet?
Somewhere in the 20th century, Soviet productions began to remove the mime scenes from all acts, but most offensively acts 2 and 4. This move weakened the ballet structure and the storytelling, relying almost exclusively on a summarized version of the action that appeared in the production's program. This coincided with the trend to change the ending and the addition of my aforementioned enemy. It was also around this time that Benno started to disappear from productions for reasons that are never clear, although it probably didn't help that most of Benno's actual role in the original production was helping Siegfried pick up a debt. In Soviet ballet, the removal of both the mime and the tragic ending is arguably a political choice. As Jennifer Homans writes, the line separating dance from propaganda was often perilously thin, and deliberately so. Ballet companies under the Soviet state were under heavy political scrutiny, and it would stand to reason that the political preference was to give audiences a happy ending that celebrates Russian legacy, and a series of technical accomplishments instead of mime, to further spread the idea of the technical prowess of the Soviet dancers. This hideous trend has been adopted by many modern productions, replacing the expressive mime of Act 2 for a bland, seldom innovative pas de deux. This is a great disservice to the event of choreography because he ultimately does give the lovers a pas de deux in Act 2, literally just 2 scenes later. Their first meeting, full of trepidation and uncertainty, is ignored for what often amounts to a few lifts and acrobatics that actually rob the ballet of one of its most expository scenes. How does Siegfried know what's happening to Odette? And actually, how does he know that his later betrayal in Act 3 will be as powerful as it eventually is?
If political pressure led to the Soviet productions to remove the mime and change the ending, well, that's understandably part of the history of 20th century ballet. But these days we really have no excuse to continue that absurd tradition, especially not outside of Russia.
Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not arguing that every company out there should have the very same Swan Lake production. As much as I see a lot of value in reconstructions like the Radmansky ones, I also find that new takes can be very creative and keep a ballet alive for new audiences. But if you're going to do a new production while removing inherent themes, structure story beats, and literally add a clown for laughs, then that's not really Swan Lake anymore, and at that point you might as well do an entire new production inspired by Swan Lake. Which is again what a series of choreographers have been doing since the later part of the 20th century. Complete reinterpretations are increasingly creative, like Christopher Wheeldon's Swan Lake, set in a ballet company actually producing the classic Swan Lake. Jean-Christophe Maillot's Lac or Gray Murphy's Swan Lake are popular ones as well, although none of them have had the success of Matthew Bourne's version, partially because it was featured in 2000's Stephen Daldry film Billy Elliot. His Swan Lake is an entirely different story set to Tchaikovsky's music in a different arrangement and follows a young prince who falls for a male swan. With the exception of Wheeldon's, all of these productions are available either for purchasing or for streaming.
But if you're a new viewer or you're just trying to learn more about Swan Lake, the wealth of available productions might make you a little bit clueless. Once a production says that it's actor Petepa and Ivanov, it's really impossible to tell them apart from just promotional material or Instagram posts. So I put together this little list of some productions of Swan Lake that are widely available, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about them.
Part of a series of ABT film productions, the 2005 Swan Lake stars Angel Correia and Gillian Murphy, featuring a production by Kevin Mackenzie. I personally don't quite love this production. I don't like the costumes, they look unintentionally Elizabethan to me. The lighting doesn't translate very well to the camera, so some scenes in Act 2 and 4 look overwhelmingly blue, while Act 3 is very orange. But it does have a healthy amount of mime, there's no jester, and Angel Correia is completely breathtakingly dreamy. This one is available for purchase. The Paris Opera has a production by Nureyev since 1984. A cast starring Agnello Tessu and Jose Martinez is on Amazon Prime and on Marquee TV. This one has Regency-like costumes and a couple of peculiar moments, like when Von Rothbard seemingly enchants Siegfried and they have a rather intense pas de deux. But the costumes are breathtakingly beautiful, the corps de ballet is fantastic, and it has a pleasant dose of mime. The Royal Opera House has 2 productions available. My favorite one is the one by Sir Anthony Dowell. It retains a lot of the Ashton choreography, but it intends to be more faithful to the Ivanov Petepa tradition, down to the costumes for the swans, which many people hate, but I actually completely loved. This performance is available for purchase with 3 different casts, a 2009 production with Núñez and Soares, 2012 one with the Sepepa Golding, and another one with Janowski Kish. It includes all of my favorite things about Swan Lake. The mime is beautiful, the theme is intact, it has a beautiful musical arrangement, and it has my favorite addition to Act 4 as the Odette and Siegfried forgiveness scene. But, and this is a very big but, the costumes are very dull. They absolutely show wear in the available performances, especially in Acts 1 and 3. The production has quite the 80s feel that alternates between Phantom of the Opera and Meatloaf music video. This production was replaced in 2018 by a new Liam Scarlett production of Swan Lake with designs by John McFarlane. The designs are absolutely stunning, but I would have preferred an updated design to the Dowell production instead of an all-new one. This one is available too, performed by Marinella Núñez and Vadim Montagarov. In 2016, Alexei Radmansky reconstructed the Ivanov Petepa production for the Zurich Ballet. He did it based on the notations in the Sergeyev collection, a large archive of classical ballet records owned by the University of Harvard. This production is sadly not available for purchase or stream. Some parts of it are on YouTube, but there's no official release, so this is a production that I'm keeping my eyes out for, hoping that one day it will be released, although the odds are not in my favor.
I think that's really sad. Not just because I really personally want to see the production. I genuinely believe that there's a great value in bringing the 1895 production to a modern audience. It really would reflect that the themes of Swan Lake are actually timeless. I just think it's strange how Swan Lake seems to be the one ballet that's strayed so far from its intended purpose. And it's really interesting to me that some other ballets really inspire some kind of ferocious anger. People will have no problem saying that yellowface in Nutcracker is traditional or that blackface in La Bayadere is art. If what you're saying is that you have no problem with removing really essential thematic elements from Swan Lake, but you have a massive problem with removing superfluous but deeply problematic elements of other ballets, then the problem really is not tradition, is it?
What you're seeing on screen right now are a few of my sources. I'm leaving links for them down below so that you can click them if they're easily accessible. Thank you so much if you have made it this far. This project is something that I've been working on for a long time in one capacity or another, so it's really exciting for it to come together now. Please do comment and tell me your thoughts, and share with me anything that you liked or that I did wrong, or if I dissed your favorite ballet. Please by all means call me out. Comment and share the video with people you think might be interested, and please subscribe because I do have a lot more things that I want to talk about in regards to other ballets, so hopefully that's coming very soon, and I hope to see you guys very soon again. Thank you.